name's Tom Robinson. It's a delight to be here. So I'm from the Southwest Nuclear Hub. As Stuart said, we're a membership organisation of universities, industry and SMEs, all working together to promote research and innovation in nuclear in the Southwest. So my role is to link academics with industry, and I'm here today to reach out as part of that. So I'm going to quickly give a brief history of nuclear and talk about how our history has influenced our current landscape. The differences between fission and fusion is probably a good place to start, and then some challenges and opportunities for the sector. So fantastic. Fusion and fission. You may all know this already, but with fusion, we're talking about powering the sun, and with fission, we're splitting the atom. So fusion, you take two very light elements and you combine them together, and that releases energy. And with fission, you have one heavy element and you split it up, and again, that releases energy. So these are the kind of one-line explanations that you get for fusion and fission. And whilst they're handy, I don't think they really give you much. So because I'm a physicist and because I work at a university, I've got one slide of science, and I'm going to talk you through some science, and then we'll go on to the rest of the talk. So you'll be aware, hopefully, that everything is made up of atoms, and those atoms are made up of nuclei, nucleuses, and electrons. And those nucleuses themselves are made up of protons and neutrons. So every single element on the periodic table has a nucleus, and that nucleus is a different weight, a different mass. And if you line them up along the bottom here, you go from the very lightest of elements that we have, which is hydrogen, up to the heaviest, sorry, that's my watch, heaviest elements that we have in the world is naturally occurring is uranium. And that's what we use for our nuclear fission fuel. Now, a nucleus and the protons and neutrons contained within it are bound together with energy. And this energy is called binding energy because it binds together the nucleus. And each different element has a different binding energy that binds together those protons and neutrons. And if you map it out on a graph, you get this kind of swoosh. It's a bit like a Nike tick, but upside down. It's steep at the front and then shallows out. So what we're trying to do with fission and fusion is we're looking at where we've got low binding energy, so where the protons and neutrons aren't bound very tightly. They've got a bit of room to wiggle and maneuver and be quite energetic. And we're looking at moving it from these low binding energy states to high binding energy states where they're constricted, in fact, really tight. So in fusion and fission, we're looking at two different sides of the same graph. So fusion, we've got two light elements. Typically, we've got deuterium and tritium, which are down here on the graph, and we're looking at combining them into typically helium. So we're looking at releasing all of this energy from the nuclei, releasing this binding energy, and we're using that energy to power our turbines. From the other side of the coin, we've got fission. So we've got our heavy elements, uranium, and there we're splitting the atom, again, making, sorry, this is a touchscreen, making what is a heavy element into lighter elements, again, releasing binding energy. And that's what we use to power our systems. So the last thing I'll say on this slide is uranium and fission was actually discovered because scientists back in the 30s wanted to make a heavier element. So they got the heaviest element that they could find on planet Earth, which is uranium, and they bombarded it with neutrons to try and make something that was heavier still. And during this bombardment, by adding neutrons to uranium, it actually split the atom, and they found barium, which is somewhere here-ish, I don't know where. And so that was a surprise. They weren't expecting it, but it released a lot of energy in the process. And from that discovery, we've come on to fission energy. Okay, so that's fusion and fission, two sides of the same graph. And that's my science slide, you'll be pleased to know. So that's how it works for one reaction, but how do you actually sustain that, and how do you produce energy from what is one single reaction? So if we start with fusion, you've got your deuterium and tritium, and you're pushing that together to create helium. your two nuclei have a positive charge because of the protons in that nuclei. So when you try and bring them together, it's like bringing together two north magnets. They're going to repel each other. So you actually have to put energy in to overcome that electrostatic repulsion and actually get them to fuse. So when you've got fusion, you have this startup energy, this kind of ignition energy that Stuart was talking about. And so it's quite hard to actually start that reaction. And not only that, if you put in the energy to overcome that, then you've got to sustain that. So you're not actually getting one reaction, but you're getting enough reactions to actually produce meaningful energy. So it's quite difficult to do. On the other hand, fission is really easy. So if you have a uranium atom, you hit it with a neutron, it will split. And when you split a uranium atom, it's not an easy split often. It's like trying to split an Easter egg. So sometimes if you split an Easter egg, it comes out in two perfect halves, but more than likely it comes out in little bits. And so when you get your uranium atom and you split it up into these little bits, you get more neutrons. And that neutron then can go on and hit another uranium atom and split again. And so you get this cascade effect. You get what's called a chain reaction. So from one fission of uranium, you can create a lot more. So you get this cascade effect. It's very easy to get energy out of. It's very easy to produce and maintain and continue. And so it's quite a simple process. Okay. So if we look at the history of fission and fission rather, it's kind of strangely mirrored, but not necessarily by design. So I'm going to go through history. Fusion was actually first theorized in 1920. So that was 18 years before fission was even discovered. But we're still working to try and overcome those energy barriers that I talked about to actually harness fusion as an energy source. On the other side, fission, because it's quite straightforward and because of this chain reaction, it was discovered in 1938. And within 7 years, they'd already developed the first nuclear bomb. So obviously a sign of the times. This was around World War II. There was a lot of conflict, and the weaponization really progressed that scientific development. And so the actual war effort and this weaponization of technology actually set the UK on the path to where it is today in nuclear science. So the first reactor that we had, maybe the second, wind-scale pile, that wasn't for energy production. That was for producing plutonium in 1950. That came online, and its sole purpose was to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. But it's important because it kind of set the design tone for as we went forwards. So following that, we come to the kind of first of a kind reactors. So from a fission perspective, our first commercial nuclear reactor was Calder Hall up in West Cumbria. So that came online in 1956, a mere 18 years after fission was discovered, and the actual reactor was built within 3 years. So a tremendous engineering effort. This was one of 9 Magnox reactors to be built over the next sort of 15, 20 years. And the design of the Magnox reactors was integrated from the wind-scale piles. So the Magnox reactors, whilst creating electricity, also had a secondary function to make plutonium for the bombs. So that's why the design is as such. It uses gas as a coolant, it uses uranium oxide as fuel, and that's kind of put us on our path today for our nuclear reactors. On the flip side, in terms of fusion, we had Zeta coming online in 1957, and this was the first large-scale experiment in fusion in the UK. And here's a lovely picture of it here. It's not quite a tokamak design, but it has some similarities. I don't know too much about it, so if you have questions, I'll pass them on. My colleagues probably can't answer them, so we'll leave that one there. Okay, so the Magnox reactors, also known as Generation 1 reactors, so the first generation of nuclear power. The next 70s and 80s, we come on to our advanced gas-cooled reactors. So we still have some of these AGRs operating at the moment. All in total, 7 were built across the UK. The first were Hinkley Point B and Hunterston B in 1976. The design for the AGRs followed on from the Magnox reactors. So they use CO2 as coolant, the same coolant. They use graphite as moderator, the same kind of core. The fuel's slightly different, and it had a lot more safety features built in than the previous Magnox reactors. So these are generation 2 reactors. They're improvements mainly in safety and in the amount of energy you can get out from your fuel. So this is on second generation of nuclear reactors in the UK. On the flip side, the Joint European Torus that was mentioned, design work started in 1973 and it came online as a European experiment in 1983. I think it stopped operating last year.
Its the last campaign is at the end of this year.
There we are. So it's still going, and this is 40 years ago. So it's a testament to the engineering and the design work that it's still operating to this day. Okay, and then after the AGRs were built, there was a bit of a dip in the nuclear industry in the UK. So the government in the late 80s decided that they would build 10 pressurized water reactors, but only one was ever built, and that was at Sizewell B. So that's in Suffolk, which came online in the 1990s. And if Sizewell wasn't built, then in about 3 or 4 years, we would have no operating nuclear reactors left. Sizewell is going to operate until it's up in the air, but probably 2030s, maybe a bit longer. So it really is the kind of last bastion of our historical nuclear fleet. Also during this time, our reactors start to close. So the Magnox reactors are closing. By 2015, the last Magnox reactor closed. The AGR reactors have started to close now. We've had some in 2021, some in 2022 close. And the rest of the fleet, I think there's 4 operating reactors left. They're due to close in the next 5 years. So our nuclear energy capacity, whilst it's been supporting roughly around 20% of the UK's electricity production over the last 60 years, it's really starting to tail off as we're not getting the new plants coming online in this time period. So the other final point is the final investment decision was made on 1 reactor. That was Hinkley Point C, which is currently under construction. It's down near me in Somerset. It's due to come online. I've got it on the next slide. I think it's 2027. So there is a new nuclear facility coming online, and that is very positive. So on the other side, in Fusion, the ITER engineering designs activities began in the 90s. It's important to know about the historical timeline, particularly, so I'll come on to things like IT, but it's important to have that historical knowledge to understand where the industry is today. And then MAST, which is an experiment for a spherical tokamak, which is different from a normal toroidal tokamak, whereas one is like a hula hoop, a spherical tokamak is like a chord apple. So Jamie will probably touch on this, so I won't talk too much about that. Okay, and finally, where are we now? So we're in a period of what is called the nuclear renaissance. So a lot of interest from government, rightly so, for a variety of reasons. The government's committed to build 24 gigawatts of new nuclear by 2050. That equates to 25% of the UK's electricity demand. In the last few years, last year, the government selected the high temperature gas-cooled reactors as the generation 4 reactor design that we're going to pursue. So this has a lot of similarities to what we've had previously. So from the Windscale pile, the Magnox reactors and the AGR, there's a lot of similarities in the design. Obviously, it uses a gas coolant. It has a graphite core. The fuels are very different because it's a generation 4 reactor. We're looking at passive safety. We're looking at fail-safe fuels. And so a lot of the subtleties in the design is different, but the overall design umbrella is the same as what we've had through our historical period. In addition, Great British Nuclear was announced last week. Although it's been operating for the last 6 months or so, it was formally announced last week, which is great news. And they're running a competition for what are called small modular reactors. Now, small modular reactors are a different take to nuclear fission. Rather than the large megawatt scale reactors that we have at the moment, these are very small in footprint and also small in energy output. So depending on the design, we're looking at a few hundred megawatts to down to sort of 10 megawatts. So what you'd use these for is, rather than power electricity to the grid, you might use a localized system for a particular problem, whether that would be industry plant, whether it would be something like an IT data center, or something even more funky like a ship. You could use it to power a ship. And so we're looking at what the small modular reactor in the UK could be, and that should resolve itself at the end of the year. From a fusion perspective, we've got the government announcement for STEP. I'll let Jamie talk about STEP. That was last year. The ITER assembly has begun, so this is putting together the bits on the actual site. ITER's the next generation from JET, so it's a much bigger experiment, and because it's bigger, you should hopefully get more fuel in. You can heat more fuel up. You can overcome those energy barriers that I was talking about, and so you can generate more energy out. And they're seeing a big increase in private fusion investment that I know Jamie's going to talk about as well. So we're in a good place from a nuclear industry at the moment in the UK. We need to start building reactors, but we have all the fundamentals in place to actually go on and achieve this. Okay, so what about nuclear and IT and climate change? Because that's why we're here today. I'm going to try my best to relate it to IT, but I'm not an IT professional. So this is what I've gleaned. And if you ask me questions after, I'll do my best to answer them, but we'll see how that goes. So the first thing to say is, what can IT do for nuclear? The reason I wanted to talk about the history and the timelines is because that sets up a lot of this question. So the reactors that we're operating at the moment were either built in the 60s or they were designed, Sizewell B was designed in the 80s. So this is pre-computers, basically. So from a digital perspective, our currently operating reactors aren't set up for the new systems and new capabilities that we have at the moment. So there's a wealth of research and opportunities to actually bring the reactors that we have currently operating, even the new reactor Hinkley Point C, that had its design origins in the 1990s. So from a digital perspective, there's so much that we can bring to these current reactor fleet. And not only that, but when we look at the new reactor designs, the Gen 4 reactor designs, so things like the very high temperature gas cooled reactor and the small modular reactors, these are actually going to be the first nuclear reactors built in this digital age. So they have all these safety systems, all these operational plans, all these design parameters that will be used first of a kind. And so all of these digital tools and techniques can make a step change in how it's built, how it's manufactured, how it's developed, how it's put together, how it's operated, how it's run, and how it's decommissioned at the end of life. So there's a massive opportunity to influence the sector from that perspective. On a slightly separate angle, historically, nuclear has been very risk averse, in the sense that there's been a lot of security process. And so it's not been opened up to IT because they can't understand cybersecurity protocols. But recently that's changed. So we've had an AI strategy published by Sellafield this year. We've had the NBA publish their vision and strategy document in 2022. And so the industry is opening up to the opportunities. Now, what can nuclear do for IT? Now, there's basically two arguments to this. One, nuclear provides baseload power. So this is constant power at constant output all of the time. There's no fluctuations due to wind. There's no changes with the sunlight, and there's no carbon emissions either. So it's a great opportunity to power your data centers, your IT infrastructure that needs a steady power supply. So it's a really important technology for this sector. Not only that, but Microsoft have actually, whether this is actually a real plan or whether it's publicity, they've signed a deal with a fusion vendor, Helion Energy, to get fusion energy supplied to them in 2028. So that is very soon. 5 years from now, they're expecting fusion to provide them energy. Okay, in terms of climate, nuclear has the lowest life cycle carbon intensity of any energy source. That's including renewables, it's including wind and solar. It also has the lowest land use. because of the energy density from your fuel, you can have your large power station on a really small footprint. So compared to a wind farm that needs a large footprint, a nuclear power station is very small. And with that, it has the lowest ecosystem impact of any electricity source, because you can measure it, you can manage your site very precisely because it's so small. And my last slide, what about nuclear waste? So I assume this is on people's minds when they think about nuclear. What I would say, well, as well as being the only sector that tracks, manages, makes safe and pays for its waste, we've been operating nuclear reactors for over 60 years now. And all of the waste that's been produced in those 60 years is contained at Sellafield or the low-level waste repository or the sites themselves. And they have footprints of less than a square mile. So all of the waste over 60 years is managed in this highly engineered, highly precise stores, and it's been managed safely for 60 years. This is a picture of the geological disposal facility. So it's the long-term solution. It's going to be an engineered store embedded into bedrock. So we've got not only the engineering protections, but also the geological protections. We've got natural analogues for how this would work in practice, and we're working on geological timescales here. So the geology is stable for millions of years, so we can embed our waste into this facility, and it will be safe for millions of years. The last thing to say about nuclear waste, and it relates back to the slide we had at the start, fusion will be a lot cleaner because it's not producing all of the heavy elements that uranium would. So the actual waste from the fusion reactor should only last 30 years potentially of being radioactive. So it's theoretically not only a clean fuel, but also a zero waste fuel.
My name's Jamie. I'm from the UK's Fusion Lab, which is the UK Atomic Energy Authority. That was a really good presentation by Tom. I'm really pleased he's presented some of the historical where we've come from in fusion, because that means I don't have to cover that. I'm going to talk more about where we're going with fusion. So before I do that, I'll just say a little bit about where I've come from. So it's probably worth putting it in context. So Tom mentioned the Magnox reactors as the first fleet of power stations in the world that were using atomic energy, and are certainly the starting point for atomic energy in this country. So I started my career working on those power stations, looking to put those to bed at the end of their lives. So decommission those reactors. That's where I started as a graduate. I then worked at the World Nuclear Association for a while, which is a trade association for nuclear energy. And I'll mention that because it is a company that kind of helps to bring together the whole of this globalized sector for nuclear fission energy. And my role now at the UKAEA is to think about how that globalized fusion sector might operate in the future. So I'm a passionate advocate for both fission and fusion. They're very complementary technologies. I've got a background in fission as well as fusion, so I'll do my very best to try and not interrupt when Tom answers questions on fission. But yeah, passionate advocate for both. So fusion is what I'm going to talk about today. So as Tom mentioned, I'm not going to go back over this. It is the process that powers the sun. It's worth noting that to get that process to work on Earth, where we don't have this absolutely massive gravitational potential that's creating a huge amount of pressure that's crushing all those atoms together, we actually have to go to much, much higher temperatures to try and get fusion to work here on the surface of the Earth. So we're looking at in fusion reactions happening inside those magnetic containment vessels of around about 150 million degrees, which is around about 10 times the temperature in the sun. So it really is quite a challenge from a technology point of view to get that to work. And that's why we've been on this really long journey that started way back at the same time as fission was being looked at. And we still haven't yet managed to turn that into a power station. But hopefully I'm going to talk to you or convince you that we can do it and it is on its way. So fusion has a few benefits. Like nuclear, many of these will look familiar from nuclear fission technology. So like nuclear, it's low carbon. It doesn't emit any carbon when you're generating energy. It's a safe technology. So as Tom mentioned, it has a slightly different waste profile, and it has a slightly different safety case in terms of how you manage the hazard from the actual generation itself. As I've described, it's very difficult to make that fusion reaction happen. So that means it's also very easy to make it stop, because when you collapse the plasma, when you stop controlling that plasma, it's a very low density material. It dissipates and the reaction stops instantaneously. So we don't have that decay heat challenge, which the colleagues in fission have to worry about. It's reliable, again, base load like fission, and it's sustainable in the sense of there's an awful lot of fuel available on the Earth to power fusion power stations. This is a kind of a picture, a cartoon of the different technologies that are happening in the space of toroidal magnetic confinement fusion, which is the kind of dominant pathway, I would say, for the countries and companies are looking at to try and commercialize the technology, try and turn them into power stations. I won't spend long on this because we've talked about it a lot, but it's to say there's kind of like two pathways going on here. There's JET, which is the donut-shaped plasma that we talked about, and we had the picture of at the beginning, which started back in the 80s and is leading on to the huge ITER experiment in the south of France, which we also heard about currently being constructed in Cadarache, which will still be an experiment, but will produce net energy gain for the first time in this magnetic configuration. And that is on a pathway to an even bigger machine, which is being theorized, called DEMO, which will be a demonstration power station. And in the UK, we're kind of taking a bit of a branch off of that path, very, very much a kind of a parallel path, but with a slightly more compact design called a spherical tokamak. Whenever you see the acronyms ST, you often find that stands for spherical tokamak in fusion. So we've had the MAST reactor that was mentioned in Tom's talk in the UK AEA for many years. And that is kind of like the technology genesis for the spherical tokamak for energy production, which is the project I work on. And that's a kind of a UK parallel branch to this, where we think we can get to energy production a bit faster than this branch here. This is a kind of a very generic picture of what's going on internationally. It's a kind of like schematic of saying how we're moving along on the sort of time axis along here towards power generation from fusion, and represents, I guess, a kind of an overview of most of the public sector government-driven programs that are going on around the world. In this case, we've got ITER, which is the experimental reactor, and DEMO being developed in parallel to that. The key difference being DEMO fully self-sustaining on fuel and producing energy for the grid, which ITER won't do, and supported by a kind of a range of international facilities that are essential to making those machines work, those fusion machines work. Things like neutron sources, so that we can test materials to make sure they're going to survive the fusion environment. And this is kind of like a steady step-by-step process for which we're building bigger machines to extrapolate from ones we've operated in the past almost directly. But the private sector has emerged, I would say, really in the last has certainly, if you like, really gone through a big growth step in the last 2 years, where a lot of extra money has gone in on the back of some of those breakthroughs that have been talked about. And they're looking to shortcut that even faster. And they're looking at a whole range of different technologies. Some of them are the magnetic technologies we've talked about, and some of them are inertial confinement technologies, which are very different, using lasers or using accelerating targets and shockwaves. But they're a whole family of different technologies. And this organization, the Fusion Industry Association, which is a US-led international alliance of all the different private sector fusion companies, has had, as a sector, well over £5 billion invested in it now. This slide's actually a little bit out of date. Their latest report just came out in the last couple of weeks, and shows that that's gone up even more. But there's been a kind of a big growth in private sector, and that's a kind of really interesting dynamic, because now we've not just got these big step-by-step government programs going on, but we've got a whole bunch, a whole kind of landscape of different technologies being pursued by the private sector, and they're all quite different. They all offer different approaches, different potential benefits, different potential products. Not all of them are looking at electricity. but they're all looking at contributing to that net zero energy economy that we're going to need in the future. And some of them have extremely aggressive timescales, as we've heard. Because I work in the commercial pathway team, and our job is to think about what is the commercial fusion sector going to look like, we need to think about what the energy sector is that these fusion plants are going to operate in. And that's quite difficult because we're talking about relatively long timescales. We're talking sort of really for fusion to be making a substantial impact on the energy system, we're probably talking the second half of the century, so 2050 and beyond. And when we think about that as a energy system, it's very difficult to predict what that's going to look like. Most of the big energy organizations like the International Energy Authority, the IEA, they look up to about 2050 and don't look much beyond that. But we can probably say a couple of things about it. We can probably say that it's certainly going to be larger than it is today. Even with energy efficiency, the number of people who currently live in energy poverty in the world means that, you know, if we want to bring those people out of energy poverty, we're going to probably need to generate more energy. And probably the ways we move energy around is going to change. So the absolute amount is going to increase, and probably the vectors that we use to move it around are going to be different. Probably a lot more of it is going to be consumed as electricity than currently is used. A lot of our primary energy comes still from fossil fuels used in transport, moving things around the world, heating things, still comes from burning stuff. But that's probably going to change in the future, and it needs to change. So in that context, what can we get out of a commercial fusion plant? And the good thing about fusion, that it's still emerging as a technology, means we can think very much from first principles about what kind of energy do we want from it, and how are we going to exploit this technology, not constrained by the way that we've produced energy in the past. So this little diagram, which comes from one of our team's work on commercial fusion pathway, shows that, you know, there's kind of two real aspects that you can exploit in a fusion machine. It produces heat, and that makes it look much like any other power station. Most power stations produce heat and use that heat to turn turbines via a steam cycle. And fusion can very much do the same. So it can produce electricity. It produces potentially very high grade heat, so very high temperature heat. So it can also be used directly to produce things like hydrogen and synthetic fuels. It could be used for things like district heating, desalination, and other industrial processes where there's some really high value products that can be produced from heat. You could also exploit the neutrons directly. So a fusion reactor is a very powerful neutron source, and we can use that to, for example, irradiate materials to produce isotopes, either for medical purposes or for industrial purposes. We use a lot of medical radioisotopes to keep people healthy, and we're going to need more of those. They're quite scarce and difficult to produce. So that's one thing. And similarly, you can irradiate things for research purposes and in the production of silicon doping for semiconductor technology. And so that kind of means that, you know, fusion has quite a lot of different applications, more or less in kind of like clean cities and clean industry is kind of a good way to think about it. So a whole range of things from the aviation sector, transport, as I said, desalination, and through to industrial processes like ammonia for shipping, for example. There's a whole bunch of things we could be using fusion power stations in the future for. And that brings me on to what the UK Atomic Energy Authority is doing about that. So we've talked already about the spherical tokamak for energy production, STEP project. So that is what it says on the tin. It's a magnetic confinement technology, but for energy production. I thought it was worth just quickly flashing up the mission statement, because I think that kind of captures things relatively well. So I work within the STEP project or program, but it's part of the UK Atomic Energy Authority. So the authority's mission is to lead the delivery of sustainable fusion energy and to maximize that social and scientific benefit. But STEP has a much more specific mission to deliver a UK prototype energy plant, which is what we're working on at the moment, and a pathway to commercial viability of fusion. And that's important because by developing this new power plant, we're not just going to put a few megawatts onto the grid, we're also going to force the development of a whole load of technologies, services, things like regulation that will be needed for a commercial sector to operate. These are some of the kind of success criteria, if you like, the step will be judged by. Does it deliver net power to the grid? Does it accelerate our path to fusion? So we're not just going down some technology dead end, but we're actually moving ourselves forward to something that can be scaled up and deployed at scale. Is it competitive? Are we demonstrating a pathway to where this electricity or energy can be produced economically? Fuel sustainability is a big challenge for fusion. We need to be able to breed the fuel, the tritium fuel that we need, and that hasn't yet to be demonstrated. And so on. These are factors which will decide whether or not this technology is actually commercially deployable or not. And where we're going to be doing that has been announced in the last year or so. Up in West Burton in North Nottinghamshire is an old coal-fired power plant that came off the bars earlier this year for the last time. It was held in standby for the winter and is now closed. And this quite large site along the River Trent is now available for us to go and build our fusion reactor on. So at the moment, there's an old coal-fired power station, an operating gas plant, and then this whole area here, which we're going to be building our power station, making the use of all things like connections to the national grid and access to cooling water that those power stations. So a kind of a neat story in a way, the sort of fission to fusion, fossil to fusion story. So closing the old dirty coal plant and building a nice new clean fusion plant. And I'll just sort of finish here with, this is what we're trying to achieve. So we're kind of here in this phase at the moment. You can see we've got a long journey to go. I'm not going to promise you electricity by 2028, I'm afraid, but our target is to put energy on the grid in the 2040s, targeting as early in that decade as possible. So you can see that at the moment we're working on a concept design. We'll be taking that through to a detailed design, working very closely with industry in the next phase, and then moving from that into construction and then into actual commissioning and operating that plant in the 2040s. So that's what STEP is there to do. And I think that is my last slide.